So sometimes there is a kind of alchemy that happens between a professor and a group of students. And the class of 2018 was picking up what Jennifer Rittner was putting down. Jennifer is a new member of the faculty who is teaching our design history course, specifically a section devoted to considering design history through political and social issues. As a lifelong educator, Jennifer is also the founder of the consultancy Content Matters, and before this she worked for Pentagram Design, for Columbia University's Center for New Media Teaching and Learning, and for the Professional Association of Designers, AIGA. Her career as an educator began in museums. With the American Federation of Arts, she led Art Access 2, an initiative to increase museum attendance among underserved communities through education and outreach. In addition to design history at SVA, Jennifer has taught design management at Parsons, the New School for Design, and at FIT. She is at work on a series of articles that address the intersections between design and issues of social justice. Please join me in welcoming Jennifer Rittner.
Thank you, Molly, the graduating class of 2018. I'm really, truly honored that you invited me to deliver the keynote address this evening. Let's see. All right. I feel like we really shared a spirited 5 weeks together last fall, and clearly we could have gone on for at least another 5, interrogating these critical issues in our common history. My goal for our class was to shed light on people and events in history that are often overlooked in the curriculum. But beyond that, my goal as an educator and a writer has always been to give voice to ideas that have been obscured by the more standard accepted narratives. For this evening, I wanted to present intersections between the theme you explored in your studies and my own journey, specifically through my interactions with 3 women. This theme, refract, rephrase, reframe, really resonated strongly with me. In 1990, I had the pleasure of meeting this woman. She was a groundbreaking leader who initiated the transformation of an institution that had long been a bastion of a certain kind of elite male privilege. And obviously, no spoiler, I'm not talking about Hillary Clinton, the other woman in this picture, although her presence here is meaningful in that as First Lady, she stands alongside Dr. Ray Alexander Minter, accepting a painting by Henry Ossawa Tanner, the first by an African-American artist to be purchased by the White House's permanent collection. Here they are in 1996, 32 years after the signing of the Civil Rights Act, and 111 years after Tanner painted this work, titled Sand Dunes at Sunset in Atlantic City. The artist's grandniece, Dr. Alexander Minter, presents the work to the White House, thereby reframing the conversation about what constitutes an American art, an American artist, and an American heritage, a story that had long prioritized depictions and perspectives of white America first, and generally only non-white America through the lens of white American storytellers, now refracted to include the stories, one at a time, of our multitudinous cultural spaces and expressions, reframing a perspective on how we define, perceive, and identify our collective enterprise. But 6 years before this event, when I was an undergraduate at NYU, I first encountered Dr. Alexander Minter at another groundbreaking event. I had long been interested in the intersections between art and social thought, and so in 1990, I was drawn to the Why History program presented at the New York Historical Society, where Dr. Minter was head of public programs. It was deeply significant to me that the program was led by Dr. Minter, a woman of color, who seemed unwavering in her convictions and completely secure in her presentation of self in that space. She belonged there. She was a voice of leadership and an arbiter of meaningful change. As I understood it, she led the call to reframe fundamental questions about what that historic institution's purpose should be, and how they could reframe our understanding of our collective history. At that time, the Historical Society had really prided itself on its position of elite privilege, something the institution acknowledged and debated in internal discussions, and importantly, written documentation that remains in the archives for researchers and cultural critics to discover. These documents provide access to the institutional record of debate and self-interrogation that led to intentional change, away from elitism and toward inclusion. and not only inclusion, but a genuine stake in defining and co-authoring our new collective narratives. The Why History program asked the Historical Society's leadership to come to terms with what it had been, how it had shaped intellectual thought, and what it could choose to become. The voices Dr. Minter brought into that space for Why History included people who looked and sounded like me, and the people in my life who had been largely marginalized by powerful institutions. These were the voices of women. They were African American voices, indigenous voices, people we called Hispanic at the time but now labeled Latinx, workers, feminists, immigrants. Why History sought to initiate change in a way that could not be prescribed by the institution alone, and at times would cast the society in a harsh and unforgiving light. Crucially, presenters were encouraged to be provocative, to speak truth to power, and to initiate soul searching by those who had never been asked to question the basic principles of their privilege before. As you can imagine, the Historical Society received some pushback in the equivalent of 1990s tweet storms, elegantly handwritten letters on fine stationery. But the loudest voices were in favor of change, even where their own historical narratives would be recontextualized. The year after Why History was presented, I became an intern working under Dr. Alexander Minter, which was a great honor for me. The first program I was introduced to during my time there was Seneca Village, a research project led by Judy Juracheo about an African-American landowning community on the Upper West Side that had been displaced by city planners in the creation of Central Park in the 1800s. With the story of Seneca Village, we see fully embodied the scourge of our own historically self-serving narratives, as city leaders, in their zeal to claim all land as their own, set about labeling the people of Seneca Village as vagabonds, scoundrels, and squatters. The Seneca Village landowners, more than 300 of them, had built homes, churches, and schools, a community, a civic society. Yet they were painted in the public eye as criminals so that they could be credibly removed from their land. Central Park, this beautiful confection for the public good, took precedence over their lives. And as a result, a stable African-American community was displaced and rendered invisible, erased for 100 and more years from the public record. Design for the public good, design that enhances the lives of some at the expense of others. The historical record reveals the ways in which power in our city, in our nation, and in our world is often wielded against the interests of the less powerful, and how designers can be swept away by ego and conviction in pursuit of personal greatness. Again, the institution chose to reframe and refract the accepted narrative from how wonderful the creation of this public park, a gift to the city, to we must reckon with our own historic complicity in serving power over people. The main project I worked on, however, was titled Imagining the New World, an exhibition of art and artifacts from the period of first contact between Europe and the pre-existing nations of this continent. My favorite piece, and I apologize, it is not this one, so don't be confused, but I don't have access to the other one, I'm sorry. But my favorite piece, which I rejoice in showing visitors, was a map of the world in which the southern hemisphere appears at the top of the frame, as it were upside down, but not upside down. Adults could never understand what they were seeing and always had to read the label or ask an educator. But children would sit in front of that piece and immediately see the cartographer's perspective, read from top right to bottom left, Africa first, then the rest of the world. Because they hadn't yet learned the right way to see the world, they could simply see. They hadn't yet learned that mapping is a way of prioritizing reality. If we were to unpack the exhibition's meta-narrative, it would be the power of storytellers to frame reality for all of us. Its purpose was not just to teach visitors about the history of initial contact, but to challenge us to seek out, with intention, voices that counterbalance narratives that cleave too narrowly to one version of right, to a world that can only exist if seen at the precise orientation we expect. You could not enter this exhibition expecting the same old story about Columbus discovering the New World and primitive monolithic Indians bowing down to European magnificence, and not be drawn into a conversation about how and why that self-serving narrative continued to dominate the intellectual landscape long beyond its capacity to be credible. And the society at that time sought to reframe the narrative and embolden new questions, refracting what was a single line of information into a more complex, messy, and honest story. By hiring me to work on that program, Dr. Minter performed a kind of magic for me. She invited my voice into conversation with an institution of power. To say that she hired me only because I was a young woman of color is too reductionist, but because she did choose me, I was given a voice. And I actually believe that her choice was intentional, because that intention mattered, and where inclusion is concerned, intention does matter. So Dr. Minter used her platform to reframe the context of an established institution. Not alone, alongside her were allies in that effort. Above her in the power structure were those willing to address inequity and strive for change. And around her was a community that chose to engage. But she was surely a pivotal catalyst for that change, and that transition was arduous. It took the near collapse of the institution to bring into existence. The Historical Society actually closed its doors for a time, deaccessioned parts of its collections, suffered and strained, and interrogated itself both publicly and privately. But in the end, it had transformed. Not perfected, but significantly altered. And what emerged has been, as Ms. Greenfield wrote back in 1990, a revelation. Revelation reached me in other ways around the same time that I met Dr. Minter, specifically in the work of Kay Walkingstick, whose paintings hung at the time in an exhibition at the American Indian Community House, which is a very inspiring space on Broadway near Waverly Place in the Village. Kay is a fine artist, but that says very little about her, right? So let's rephrase it and add some dimension. Kay Walkingstick is a contemporary artist. She's a female, feminist contemporary artist, a woman of color, a biracial, multi-ethnic, Cherokee American, female, contemporary landscape painter. There are so many words we can use to describe her, but Kay traffics in the image, and she asks that her paintings communicate on her behalf. And to me, they do. Kay's work spoke to me. She reframed identity for me. Biracial, female, dichotomous, dual, multi, inclusive, excluded, questioning, fierce, unapologetic. I fell in love with her image of landscape that breathed deep with female transgression, with her presentation of identity as a landscape of our own making, biracial as a palimpsest of being, so many textures and colors and dimensions of being, layered, emanating outward and carved deep within the soul of our own scripted narratives, our viscerally spontaneous narratives, and our own improvised narratives. Kay Walkingstick is actually the rare female landscape painter. As she says, the pantheon of American male landscape painters, Asher B. Duran, George Innes, Thomas Cole, presented the land around them as empty and ownable, lands without culture, manifest destiny, geologic form to be transformed into boundaried political spaces, vacuums to be filled. But Kay wanted to reframe that perspective. This land is filled with stories and history and culture and life. It is deeply carved with identity and experience. It is not ownable or owned. Rather, it is the living expression of collective being. So Kay created a new visual vocabulary for presenting landscape. In a recent series of paintings, she layers across the canvas culturally specific iconography of the people who had inhabited these lands for generations. Cheyenne, Hopi, Navajo, Havasupai. These are not the icons of generic Indianness. They are as specific as language, as our stories and our belief systems. Even if we as outsiders do not have access to their specific meanings, they still pulse with life. In their constructions of culture, we get to remain the unknowing, the ignorant, the disenfranchised, and that is perhaps as it should be. When cultural domination demands omnipotent access to all forms of being, withholding meaning is the only form of power that exists for communities that have been conquered and pushed into the margins. Our communities have often suffered from misunderstanding and misrepresentation by those who have sought to own the meanings of our lives. We may find ourselves clinging more tightly to constructions of self that cannot be shared. And as people in power encroach over and over on our cultural representations, we find ourselves reframing, rephrasing, and refracting those meanings so that we can once again own them and ourselves wholly. Oh, Eric, can you turn off the volume on this video? I'm sorry. Is it possible? To own oneself is a challenge for many people who have been marginalized by circumstance. I have spent the past 48 years watching my own mother's struggles with meaning and representation. I've watched as people discarded, undervalued, and ignored her. Perhaps because her otherness disorients them, makes them feel vulnerable to their own capacity for being othered. My mother was the first person to paint pictures in my mind with words. When I was young, she would fill me with stories about her life, but she cannot write her own story. And yet she yearns to be heard, to be seen as something other than how she has so often been perceived, as having little to no value beyond what her body could do for others, beyond her capacity to toil pleasantly and silently around the margins of their lives, ever present yet profoundly excluded, creating consonance but entirely unheard. Over a lifetime, she has sought those who could mentally construct interpretations of her that exist beyond the pigmentation of her skin or the particular role of her ours. She would fill me with stories about her life because no one else could or would hear her. As a result, she has learned a unique kind of silence. She speaks, but she stopped caring if she makes sense, since no one cares to understand her anyway. Who will include her voice with intention into our collective story? The narratives you present to the world in your work will come from many sources, from your own experience, interwoven with tales told to you when you were children, from the people you have studied and worked with, whose intentions and goals have intersected with your own, and perhaps who reflect and represent nuanced aspects of your own being, from research and discoveries and experiences, from people you may never know personally, but whose work moves and speaks to you. Hopefully, their stories will send you off in new directions. And your research, writing, and design will surely impact others as you exercise your capacity to interrogate truth and bring new colors, perspectives, and challenges to our collective narratives, asking questions of yourself as well as the systems and institutions that constrain or liberate us. You 7, designers, researchers, and writers, have given voice to ideas that have changed each of us here. I look forward to seeing how far your voices carry and the intention with which you forge new paths forward for all of us. I thank you for your thoughts, your words, and your intentions. And congratulations to the class of 2018.